We're here live with Michelle Lyons, author of Death Row: The Final Minutes. Hey, Michelle, this is Dee and Kate here from Sick and Wrong. Thanks for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Uh,
Hello.
so, over the course of your 12-year career as a reporter and then a public information officer for the TDJC, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, you've attended over 280 executions carried out at the Texas State Penitentiary. How did you end up getting, I guess, that assignment as a new reporter? Like, was the execution beat one of the more undesirable ones? Like, how did this land in your lap?
Well, that's the thing. It was definitely not an execution beat. It was the prison beat, because the city of Huntsville is where the prison is headquartered for Texas, and that's the newspaper I worked at. I worked at the Huntsville Item. So I moved to Huntsville in 1998, and at the time I thought I'm going to stay 6 months. I'm going to work at the paper, and then I'm going to get a job at some huge newspaper and be discovered as the greatest journalist ever. That was my plan. So when I moved to Huntsville, I knew the executions were carried out there, and I'm born and raised Texan, but I'd never been to Huntsville really, and was not. The death penalty just wasn't something I'd really given a lot of thought to. Had not been impacted by it in any way, shape, or form. It was just there. And so in 2000, after I had been working at the paper for a couple of years, there was a woman who was covering the prison beat, and she was leaving the newspaper, and so I took it on, because at the time I knew that there were all these different things about the prison system that people just had no idea about. And I was thinking about, there's all these industries in the prison system, the things where like the inmates repair school buses and they go out to the low income school districts, or they refurbish computers that go out to the income or low income school
Did they
districts.
used to make
I
license
wanted to
plates?
do all these feature stories. And I knew executions were a part of the beat. And I knew in any given year, there might be 12 executions. I mean, sometimes maybe as many as 15 or 16. But in 2000, so the year I start covering it, there were 40 executions that year.
Ooh.
And so my very first year of covering this, all of a sudden I'm watching executions. I mean, almost it seemed like once a week. I mean, there's 52 weeks in the year. There were 40 executions. There were some weeks that we were doing more than one. There was one night we did two in one night. It was just an insane schedule that a lot of people believed had to do with the fact that our governor at the time, George Bush, was running for president. And so there were judges across the state, setting these dates to put pressure on him. It was a crazy year.
I was going to ask, so where did the money come from that? Because it costs a lot of money to put on executions, doesn't it? Doesn't it cost less money for them to keep the prisoner kind of alive?
It's not the execution itself that is expensive. The chemicals are actually really cheap, or they were at the time. Now there's different issues with obtaining some of the chemicals, so it's different. But at the time that I was there, they used a 3-drug method, and it was less than $100 to do. But you are correct. It is more expensive to carry out the death penalty. It's not the process itself. It's that most of the inmates who are going through all of those appeals are indigent. They don't have the money for legal appeals. So they have a court-appointed attorney. And so if you're talking about filing all these appeals, you're going to the Supreme Court, things like that, it's the legal fees that really, really add up, to where you're exactly right. Keeping them as a inmate serving a life sentence is less expensive. But the problem too, when I first started covering it, was that we didn't have life without parole in Texas. And so I think that's a lot of why there were so many people, because it's not that way anymore. At the time that I started covering executions, there were like 450 men and women on death row. And that number is now down in the 200s, because now Texas does have life without parole. And so some juries are using that option instead of assessing death,
instead of choosing the death penalty. So as a witness to the execution, in your column or what you were reporting on, do you describe the proceedings in full detail, including like their last words and what exactly happened? Like who's I guess the demographic for this? That's what I'm wondering.
Well, at the Huntsville Item, it's a small community paper and it's north of Houston. So our philosophy was, we don't need to be covering the national news because people are taking the Houston Chronicle or the Dallas Morning News for that. We were a local newspaper. And so we were covering anything happening in the city. So if you have an execution taking place, obviously you're reporting on that. And it really was just reporting exactly what was happening. There was always background on the case. When I was writing these stories, I would try and talk both with the prosecutor and with the inmate before he was executed. And at the execution itself, it was covering what is their last statement? What did they request as the last meal? Did any of the witnesses do something out of the ordinary? You know, where was somebody pounding on the glass, or you know, it was
what
just
exactly
to look at
happened?
all the color of what's going on.
So, do you recall the first execution that you witnessed?
I do. I did witness one in 98, right when I had gotten to the newspaper. The woman covering the executions had a conflict and couldn't go. And so I covered just that one in 98 and then didn't start doing it again until 2000. It was a man named Javier Cruz, and it was a case out of San Antonio. And I remember him. I remember what he looked like. I remember the crime. He had killed two elderly men with a hammer. He had basically bludgeoned them to death with a hammer. I don't remember a ton else about the crime. It was more just the going there and just how unfamiliar all the setting was, and then witnessing the execution, going back and having to file my story.
Do you recall like any emotions you might have felt during or after? Like, were you nervous?
I was not, because I think the woman who covered them was pretty good about telling me what to expect. But I guess my career trajectory was a little bit different in that I was really young. I was 22 when I saw that
Wow.
first
Yeah.
execution, but my dad is a newspaper guy. That's how it ultimately I got into journalism. I was at first never going to do it because your parents want you to do something and I'm going to be rebellious. No, I'm going to go to business school. And instead, I had like a 0.7 at the mid semester as a business major and realized, yeah, this is my thing. So I became a journalist. But my point is that I had worked at my dad's newspaper starting when I was 16, and so I had been the photographer at that time. So by that time, by 22, I had covered fatalities and I had covered,
Car
fires
accidents,
and
things
things
like
like
that.
that
Yeah.
that were really ugly to see. So I think that knowing that I was going to see something that was described to me as being very clinical, I was okay. When I got back and my dad was asking me how it was, I think I felt a little bit concerned in the way that I thought, I feel like I should feel something more, and I didn't. And I was worried, is that a commentary on me or who I am? And then I dismissed it and thought, no, I'm a journalist. I'm supposed to be unbiased. I'm supposed to just go in and report something. Looking back on it now, it's like you are supposed to be unbiased and everything. It is a bizarre assignment.
I mean,
Going and actually watching someone die is a very, very bizarre feat and
especially at that
assignment.
Yeah.
age. But I mean, I guess you have that professional level of a detachment, sort of, that you kind of develop over time.
That, and I think too, it's like when especially you're young and you're a woman, you feel this need to constantly be proving yourself anyway. So I think even if I had gone in and had a really hard time, there's no way I would have
You
said
would have
something to
shown it, yeah.
anybody.
So like
That was always my issue.
I'm
speaking
assuming,
of like the women on death
yeah.
row,
So,
did they like generate more publicity? Did they get it easier than the male inmates in a way? Because you
They
did say in your
definitely
book,
had it easier. Yeah, their
yeah,
time on death row was easier because the men, there were so many of them, and they were in this unit in Livingston, Texas, where they were locked down in their cells 23 hours a day. And the whole reason for that was that there had been a death row escape. And they reasoned that through their investigation, found out the reason that it had been planned was because they had so much freedom, the men on death row. They used to have a work program and they used to go to church together and things like that. That's how they were able to plan this escape. And so they locked him down after that. The women never went through that. So when I would go to female death row, and you only had 10 women at the time on death row, they almost lived in like a little dorm. It was like a little pod. And they were able to come into a common room and they ate together. And they had a work program where they made dolls. They made these dolls and you could buy them. Yeah, I thought they were very, to me, a little creepy, the dolls. They were kind of like a Cabbage Patch Kid, but
yeah, that
not.
is weird.
And anyway, that's
weird.
what they would do.
So I'm assuming most of the executions you witnessed were male, but how many females did you ever see being executed?
I witnessed two women. Again, it was such a small
Yeah.
population that it was rare that one came up. I did not see Carla Faye Tucker, which was the huge female execution. I moved to Huntsville 2 months after that. So I saw a woman named Betty Lou Beets, who they referred to as the Black Widow because she murdered husbands and buried them in the backyard. I saw her, and the thing about her execution, that was the first one where I'd seen in the victim's room. It was two sons. She had murdered each of their fathers, and they high-fived each other. That was the first time I'd ever seen any of that. Again, this was in 2000, so this is my first year of witnessing executions, because you usually didn't see a lot going on in the victim's room. Not a lot of outward displays of emotion in any way, and they had high-fived because she killed her dad, you know. And then the other was a woman named Frances Newton, who had killed her children and her husband. And the weird thing about it, I liked Frances. She was always very polite and stuff, but it used to unsettle me because I was pregnant at the time that her execution was scheduled. So I was going to see her, and she would ask about my pregnancy a lot, but I'd be standing there with my giant stomach, and it just made me uncomfortable because she'd killed her kids,
Yeah, that's creepy.
Yeah, I didn't love it. I didn't love it.
So you just mentioned, so the victims' families are separate from the killers' families? Like, is there two separate rooms?
Yes, there are two separate rooms, so they never see each other, and it's completely orchestrated that way because obviously emotions are high. Could be confrontations, so the rooms are side by side and they're separated by a wall. So the victim's family, when I would witness, the victim's family was standing nearest to the inmate's head, and then the inmate's family was standing closer to their feet. But it was actually easier for the inmate who's being executed to see their own family because they could just look straight down. Whereas to see the victims, they had to turn their head all the way to the side to see them. So it was designed that way so that they could see both rooms if they wanted.
I remember you saying in the book that the wall is paper thin.
Yeah, that was
they could hear each other. Like, why?
And I hated that. It always bothered me because, the victim's family would be in there. And a lot of times, like I said, you didn't see a lot of emotion in there because they've gone through all of this. In a lot of cases, it's been years, a decade, some longer. And this is a final chapter for them. But then on the other side of the wall, you have a family who's watching their loved one die. And so they have a lot of emotion going on in that room. And so I don't love that as the victim's family, you have to hear the anguished cries of this woman over here who's watching her son die, and vice versa. I don't like that they can hear each other, and I don't know why they don't design that room better.
Did you ever see any kind of like fracas or did anyone ever yell something at each other, or do they just avoid each other completely?
They don't ever see each other. In all the executions I witnessed, there was never one instance where the two families met because they staged them in different areas before the execution. And then the way that we bring them in and out, it's choreographed so that they never cross paths. So no, I never saw that.
So what happens afterwards though? Are they hanging out outside? Or they're like donuts, coffee? Like what?
Yeah, is there a wake?
Yeah, no. Well, so there's a contract with the local funeral home. And so the funeral home immediately takes the body back to the funeral home. And so the family can go there, the inmate's family. And then the victim's family usually stay for a little bit and they do a debriefing with the victim services department. And a lot of times they'll do a press conference afterwards. So they still never see each other. The room or the buildings are locked down. So
I've read that most of the executions are by lethal injection, but do they still do any other methods like hanging? I know they used to, Old Sparky, didn't they have an electric chair in Texas?
They did have Old Sparky, but that's been, it hasn't, in Texas, it's been lethal injection since 82, which is when the first one took place. Texas does not. Some states do. It's my understanding, unless it's changed, in Utah, you can still change or choose one of the 5 methods. So firing squad, hanging, lethal injection, electrocution. Yeah, you can still choose which one you want.
What do you think, in your personal opinion, is the most humane?
I'd have to go with lethal injection. It was just so fast, and again, I never saw anything but lethal injection, but from what I've heard about the gas chamber, it's that's suffocating and all of that, which just no. Firing squad seems pretty twisted. I don't know exactly how that works.
Romanticism with that, though. I don't know why. Maybe.
I think it's, what most men are like, no, I'm going to go out in a blaze of glory and let's do firing squad. As a woman, I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. So I would go with lethal injection because especially again, the way I saw them all with the 3 drugs, they were administered in such rapid succession that they were done over the course of less than 2 minutes. And then
it's that quick.
the person was gone. Yeah. The one drug is not as fast. It doesn't seem, and I never saw them that way, but when I see the articles and I read the amount of time between when they started and when it ended, it's almost double what we were in.
And the inmates just pass out and fall into like a never waking slumber, right? It's just that quick.
Yeah, each of the three chemicals was a lethal dose. So if you had just administered one of them, it would have killed them. It's just it would have taken longer. So the first drug is a lethal sedative, so it knocks them out. The second was a muscle relaxer. That's the it collapses the lungs and the diaphragm. So when you hear the articles or you read in articles where they're talking about a coughing or snoring or any of that, it's because the second drug is hit. And then the third drug stops the heart. So when you deliver them that quickly, it's a very, very fast death.
So did you ever witness a botched execution? Like
No,
one that
not in
didn't work?
Texas. No, I've read about them in other states. I've read about the gentleman.
Right.
I think it was at Arizona or Oklahoma.
Was
Which
it
one was it where he?
Clayton what's he called? Claret Dayton?
Yeah, I've not.
Dayton?
But
He's
it
the
was
one
where
in
he basically died of a heart
2014.
attack
Yeah,
because
that's him.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, nothing like that. The only one, and I didn't witness it, Larry Fitzgerald, who was my mentor and former spokesperson at the prison system, had to witness one where the man had tried to kill himself before the execution. And he was taken to the hospital and they saved him. They had to pump his stomach and everything, and they gave him something with charcoal, which I guess absorbs the medication that he had taken. And then he was executed a few days later, and the chemicals reacted poorly with what was in his stomach, and so he was like vomiting, and it was just a really nasty scene. But again, I wasn't there.
Oh, so they
Wow.
revived him to execute him.
A lot of people, yes, they're always surprised at that, but it's because it's as long as the inmate is in our custody, it's our responsibility to keep them alive and keep them safe. And then when we get that warrant that says they have to be executed, is then the state's responsibility to execute them on that day. A lot of people have asked that, well, why wouldn't you have just let him die? But
Well,
the
because it was the
state has an
state's.
obligation. They can't.
So you
And
mentioned Larry, and
Mhm.
Larry is such a big character in the book. Like I would have
Yes.
loved to have met Larry. Was there any like anecdotes or stories that were just like too spicy, as the kids say, to put
Too
into the
spicy to
book?
put in the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what? Since I wasn't at the prison system, I didn't care. It's like,
Yeah.
let's just put him in. No, I mean, as you saw in the book, I mean, he was extremely um mischievous, however you pronounce it, but he was very naughty in the little things that he would do. The thing I wrote about with him taking me to, I mean, I just gotten there, just started working there, and he brought me to one of the prisons where they were doing classifications, and I walk in and there's, I don't know, dozens and dozens of naked men all around me taking showers. It was so mortifying, and yet I thought, well, I've just got to accept this, because if I act like I am shocked, shy, or anything else, he will never let me live it down. So he did things like that to me regularly,
well,
trying to
I really
toughen me
liked
up, I'm
Larry.
sure.
he
Yeah.
developed personal relationships though with a lot of the inmates. Did you do the same, I guess, over time, or were you more detached, I guess, from them
I was a
emotionally?
little bit more detached, but part of that is because of the nature of how death row was when he started versus he started when they were much more open, at the Ellis unit, which is near Huntsville. And that again is where they were able to move around pretty freely, the death row inmates. And he could actually go to their cells and talk to them, and they allowed it. And the visits were totally different. Visitation booths were very different. There was a mesh screen and you could hear the inmate way better. When I started, they had already been moved to the Polensky unit in Livingston, and it was a totally different setup. So I only went back to their cell area, I mean, a handful of times in the time I was there, because the security was way higher. And so it was much more difficult to go back there. And it had gotten to be a lot less safe by that time, too,
Mm.
because by then I think a lot of the inmates were pretty pissed off about being locked up for 23 hours a day. So it just wasn't the same atmosphere. So the way I got to know him was going week after week and setting up their media visits, because what would end up happening is we're there for a 2-hour window, but I would get there about an hour early. I would go in and make sure everything was set up, and there'd be the inmates in their booths, and they'd want to chat. They don't really have a lot of visitors. They don't get the opportunity to chat, and so that's how I would get to know them.
Do the families typically maintain a relationship? I've often wondered about that. Like if my father, I don't know, murdered a bunch of children, like if I would even want to maintain any kind of semblance of a relationship.
Yeah.
It depends on the crime, I think. If yes, okay, maybe if your dad killed a whole bunch of children, probably not. But if, maybe if your dad kills somebody in a drug deal or something, like there was one guy who was on death row, he killed someone in a drug deal, didn't realize that the person he killed was an undercover cop. Automatic, he got the death penalty. So in a case like that, yeah, you probably still are in touch, or the crime happened so long ago. There's a lot of children who their parent committed the crime when they were babies. And so they come later on when they're older, because they never really knew the parents, stuff like that. But no, they definitely do. And then those that don't have family that keep in touch with them, because there was one man I knew, the one that I write about in the book, who had sent me the letter that started, "If you're reading this, then they've killed me." He had killed his entire family. There really wasn't anybody to come visit him.
Yeah, no one could come.
Yeah, nobody was coming for that. But a lot of them have pen pals, and a lot of them have pen pals from overseas. So they will have, and a lot of them strike up relationships with people from overseas. So they will come and stay, and they come at a specific time of the month so that they can get a visit, let's say for July. And then a week or two later, they get their August visit. And so they make the most of the trip. And so a lot of them, even if they don't have family, they have pen pals that come and visit them and write to them and send them money and such.
Well, some of them even get married,
I wanted to ask you
right?
about those Sunderland and
yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Like, did they cause more problems than usually, like blood relations? Because they're kind of wackadoo in a way themselves, aren't they? It's a very strange...
The pen pals and such, you mean? Yes.
Yeah, who end up marrying them, and then they go there for their execution.
Well, are they invited to the execution?
Yeah.
The inmate can choose who comes to witness on their behalf. And yes, usually if there were issues, it did seem to involve one of the pen pals or one of their wives that they had married since getting on death row. We had one woman who was from Germany who was refusing to put her shoes on. And I think she thought if she wouldn't put her shoes on that we would stop the execution. And that's not how it works. I mean, they basically told her, well, you can put your shoes on and go in, or you can stay out here without your shoes, but this is happening either way. And so she got her shit together and went in with her shoes. There was one instance where the family got into a big fight with the wife or the girlfriend who was from overseas over what was going to happen with the remains. Because the pen pal wanted to bring these ashes back to Europe, and the family was basically saying, no, you will not. We're going to bury him here. And so that was a big fight.
The pen pals don't get conjugal visits on death row, do they?
No.
Okay, so
Some states allow conjugal visits. Texas is not one.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah.
And even if Texas was one, they would not do it for death row. Yeah. So no, that's the thing. When you go on death row, you don't have any human contact anymore. So even when you have those final visits with your family the day of the execution, there's no touching or hugging or anything like that. And they have to do it that way because if you have someone who's about to die, you don't have necessarily a lot of incentive not to try anything you can to not have that execution go forth, including taking someone hostage. So they can't allow you to
at that
hug
point,
a child or something like that.
So would you as a reporter interview them like moments before the execution or like an hour before the execution?
As a reporter, no. As a reporter, I would see them usually a week or two before the execution because the death row days were every Wednesday. You'd go, and then if the execution was on a Wednesday, you could not see that person on that day because by the time you get to death row to do media visits, they're already on their way to Huntsville for the execution. So it doesn't work out that way. It'd be about a week. As the spokesperson, I would have to see them a few hours before the execution, which I think was probably one of the most difficult parts of being the spokesperson working executions because there's nothing good you can say to someone who's about to die. I mean,
I don't know. What were those conversations like? Like, what would you say? Like, so how you doing?
Yeah. Hey, what's up? No, I mean, there was, that was the whole thing. It was awkward. It was always awkward. And my whole point in going, when they would get into the holding cell near the chamber, they'd come from Polunsky over to the Walls unit, which is where the executions take place. So it's about a 50-minute drive. They get there, they get new clothes, their fingerprints, all the good stuff, they're processed, and then they're put in this holding cell. So it would be me, the warden, the chaplain who was assigned to that inmate who's going to spend the afternoon with them, and then some officers that were around. We would go to talk to him. And my whole role was really to just see what the demeanor was like, because the reporters would ask me, was he chatty? Was he talkative? Was he nervous? Was he, and so it was really too up to my opinion of what the person was, which was also a little bit strange, but some made it easy and they would talk. Others were very nervous. There were some that were angry. There were some that were excited. It was just, it really kind of ran the gamut. The excited was much less. There weren't that many that were looking forward to it, but we had a couple that were ready to get it over with. So which is also a bizarre conversation.
Well, I imagine they've been on death row for a long time, so like let's just get it done, at this point. So
there were some that were volunteers and when they're a volunteer, it's considered that because they waive all their appeals and ask for a date.
Wow, so they're just ready to go.
Yeah, their time on death row is 3 or 4 years.
So you read it. I read in the book that you were saying that the chaplain spends like the day with them. It gives them words of advice on how to die well. What does that mean exactly? Like, what do they say?
My friend Jim Brazel was the minister for all of the executions for some time. And he used to tell them that when the drugs were hitting, that they were going to feel like they were drowning. And he used to tell them to just go with it. He said, if you fight the wave, it's going to be worse. So when you feel it, just go with that wave. And that's what he would tell them. And you could tell sometimes when people were fighting it, that's when you would hear gasps and such more. And no matter what, it's not a pleasant sound, no matter the crime, no matter the person, it's still not a pleasant sound, for anybody involved.
Is the chaplain in the execution chamber with them?
At that time, yes. Texas has changed some of their rules since I left, and based on different lawsuits and such. But the time that I was witnessing all of those executions, the room was always the inmate being executed, the warden standing at his head or her head, and then the chaplain would be near their feet.
I wanted to ask you what's happened to Jim's Bible that was signed by all these inmates that he saw die, basically.
I don't know. I'm sure he has it. There's no way he doesn't have it, but I haven't asked him about that in a while. So there's no doubt he has it.
What about their last words? I've often wondered about this. Like, do they get unlimited time for how long they can speak, or how does that work? And were you ever shocked by any last words?
Like, if they could filibuster, no. That was always told, you will not filibuster, it will not work, we will eventually start it. And the longest I ever saw, it was an execution of a man named Gary Graham, and it was a huge controversial case. There was a lot of media attention on it. It was probably, of the executions I witnessed, the longest, most taxing day for any execution, because there were so many protesters. It was racially charged as far as the protesters go. The KKK showed up as pro-death penalty protesters. The New Black Panthers showed up opposing the execution. It was a really tense scene all day long. And then to boot, it was June in Texas, so it was 3,000 degrees. So everybody was pissed off anyway. It was an awful day. But he spoke for about 20 to 25 minutes. It was a long speech. And the only reason I have always believed they let it go that long was because the witnesses for Gary Graham it was Jesse Jackson, it was Al Sharpton, Bianca Jagger. They had all come. And I think, honestly, that the warden was afraid of cutting him off with high profile witnesses like that, because normally they're allowed 2 minutes to speak.
Oh, so it's only 2 minutes. Okay.
Yeah. It was way past 2 minutes. I mean, as a reporter, I was a reporter at the time. It's like my notebook only has so much paper in it. And I mean, we were frantically scribbling, trying to get all this stuff. I mean, he was just talking at different points, just in circles and such, trying to, I think, prolong it, which was never going to happen. But
they don't record. Are you allowed to record?
No.
So no one's bringing cell phones in or anything?
I sort of get why, and I don't. I know that there's a concern about people open recording it. I don't necessarily see what the issue with that is, because you report on the last statement anyway. I don't know if there's just a fear that it would look too voyeuristic to have that released, an actual audio recording of someone's last words before execution. I don't know, but they don't. And I wish they did, because there have been times that we argued about the accuracy of the last statement that was transcribed and we were given based on what we actually heard in the chamber.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to do shorthand to get that.
Yeah. Well, or one execution, he's spoken a different language no one knew. And what do you do with that? There's no recording of it, so you can't play it back. Couldn't translate it. I know Spanish. It wasn't Spanish, and I don't remember what the language was, but nobody knew what the hell he said.
Yeah, it's gonna be different. So I'm assuming most of them, do they usually ask for forgiveness at that time or apologize to the family, or are there spiteful ones that curse everyone out?
Yeah, no, and it's totally different. Some will apologize to the victim's family. I'm so sorry for what I've taken from you. Others will profess their innocence. Some will apologize to their own families and ignore the victim's families, and they'll apologize, I'm so sorry I put you through this. And then you have others that don't do any of that. We had one that he was taking submissions for a joke to tell from the execution gurney. So he wanted it out there when he did these interviews. Yeah, he was asking for people to send in jokes, so everybody would be paying, tuning in to see, well, which joke did he pick? And then when he got there, he was like, well, the joke's actually on you. And he said a whole bunch of stuff about the death penalty. I know. We were all like, what's the joke? Yeah. There was no joke. So that's what he said the joke was. We had a guy that made a joke about the Dallas Cowboys. It was completely random. And then we've had some that did songs. I didn't witness a man who sang Silent Night.
Wow,
but yeah, and it was because it wasn't at Christmas. Their executions don't go into late December. They really don't. So I don't know if that was just a comforting song or what, but we had another. It was one of the ones that I said was excited for the execution. He had been a biker, so he's used to being a nomad and being free and being out. And he was saying, let's rock and roll. And he started quoting a famous Texas song called The Road Goes On Forever and the Party Never Ends.
Yeah.
Oh, that's kind of a cool way to go out. So did you ever see anyone get really upset and curse other people or curse the victims or anything?
There were 2 executions that were pretty nasty as far as the last statements go. One was a case that has gotten tons of media attention, Cameron Willingham. A lot of people hold that case up and say, that this could have been an innocent man based on some of the science. But it's my understanding there was other evidence that was used to convict him. I don't know. I didn't know him particularly well. I do know the victim's mother, because he was basically convicted of setting a fire that killed his children. He and his wife were separating, and he wanted to harm her. He wanted to hurt her, and there was no greater thing that you can, I think, pain you can inflict on someone than doing something to the children, even if they're yours. So when he saw her there to witness and she was on the victim's side, he just unleashed this tirade. It was just profane. It was hateful, and called her every name you can imagine while she was standing there. Ooh. So that was one. And there was another, nice. And it was actually the night of the double execution. There were 2 executions carried out in the same night. Oh. And it was nuts. It just happened that way because you have 2 different judges in 2 different parts of the state who happen to select this day. And so the state has to do it. And the first execution was a man who was extremely angry and said a lot of ugly things to the victim's family, said, you can kiss my ass. And basically, I hope you die in a car crash on your way home. And then a few minutes later, the second man, it could not have been a more, I think, sincere apology to the victim's family. So to see him back to back like that, it'd be such a contrast was really, it's just always really stuck with me.
Wow. So you were talking about high-profile cases, and probably 2 of the most famous cases, was Tommy Linsells and Angel Resendez. You saw both of them.
I did. Yeah. So, and they were both serial killers. And so that's how they had gotten to be so famous, because not only had they kind of struck terror in Texas, and for a while, everybody knew, like, the rail car killer, Angel Resendez Ramirez. That's all he was known as, is the rail car killer, and the thing about he and Sells was that they were a little bit different than your normal serial killer in that they didn't have the same MO, and that made them harder to catch because they didn't have a similar victim every time. With Resendez, it was finally the reason he was called the rail car killer. They finally figured out that it was because he was going along train tracks and killing people in the nearby vicinity. But it's funny, Resendez and I had a really good relationship, which sounds really twisted when you're talking about a serial killer. He was always extremely polite to me, and he was very, very smart and somewhat entertaining to talk to. Sells and I did not get along at all. He was really rude. And
he comes across as a wanker.
Oh, he was such
about Tommy Lim Sells. He
was such an ass. I mean, his crimes were horrific. So were Resendez, but Sells killed children. I lived in the small town in Illinois where he had killed an entire family, and he had beat the woman until she went into labor. She was pregnant, and then killed the baby. I mean, this is a horrible, horrible, horrible human being. And we did not get along. At all.
How often did you have to deal with
And it's funny, there were truly only 2 death row inmates I didn't get along with. It was him and one other inmate who I don't think has been executed. He wasn't executed while I was there. And he got mad at me because I wouldn't allow him to keep a ballpoint pen that belonged to the correctional officer.
That's a weapon.
A weapon, basically.
I mean,
it was a weapon, and we can't just let you keep it. There's no reason you need to keep it, but it became a thing.
Well, I know Kate was eager to ask this question, but I'm also curious about it too. What about their food, like their last meals? Like, did you as a spokesperson have to arrange that or make sure it happened? Is that a thing?
I did not arrange it or anything like that. They got to choose what they wanted about 2 weeks before the execution. So the rule in Texas is it has to be an item where the ingredients already exist at the prison unit. So like some states and like federal have different rules. It's my understanding, I think federal gives you a budget. It's, I don't know, $25, $30. So for instance, the Oklahoma City bomber, from what I had read, I think chose a Big Mac. He could get food from outside. Texas doesn't allow that. You have to have food items that are stuff that we would have in the kitchen. So if you request a lobster, you will not get a lobster. You're going to get maybe one of those like frozen fish patties, because they do have those at the prison. So because of that, the most requested meal was the cheeseburger. Lots of people requested cheeseburgers, a lot of breakfast foods. The best thing, and what I personally would pick, just because I'm obsessed with mac and cheese, is mac and cheese. There was one inmate who was responsible for cooking all the last meals, and I had his mac and cheese one time, and it's probably some of the best mac and cheese I've ever had.
Oh, nice.
It was really good.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think I would have mac and cheese or fries, just lots of fries.
I would have to have cheese fries. There's a common cheese theme involved with anything I'm going to pick. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a lot of cheese.
Well,
I say that. I know I would be too nervous to eat. When I get nervous, I do not eat. And that always did surprise me when you go back there and they had eaten everything. Because I would think, how do you stomach that? There's no way I could.
Well, I guess that kind of leads to my next question, and I apologize if it's gross, but have you ever seen anyone vomit or like shit themselves on the gurney? Because if they're eating all that much food and they're nervous, like did anything like that ever happen?
No. It's my understanding the only thing that even close was what I described earlier with the guy that had the purple, that it was grape juice that had mixed with this charcoal, and I got the impression, again, I wasn't there, that it was coming out of his nose and mouth and such, which sounded pretty horrific and awful.
Would they stop the proceedings, or they're like, oh, he's going to die anyway, let's just move forward?
At that point, they can't. I always like too, on movies where they show like there's a red phone, and if that phone rings and they're going to stop the execution, that won't happen. There is actually a red phone, or there is a phone, but that phone is to only say the execution can proceed. Once that inmate is on the gurney, there's nothing that's going to stop it, because first of all, it would be extremely cruel and unusual to put someone on a gurney and have them wait for hours.
Yeah, in the last moment.
Yeah, put the needles in. That would never happen. So that doesn't happen. If they get to that gurney, it's because all appeals have been exhausted and that execution's happening. So if they did vomit or something, there's not really anything they can do.
Yeah.
But I never saw it.
So I know you probably get asked this all the time about your stance on the death penalty, but do you feel personally the same way you did about capital punishment when you started as you do now, being out of the job? I mean, you're beyond, you don't work for the TDJC anymore, right?
No, I left in 2012. No, I don't think I feel exactly the same. I think when I was younger, Again, I started at 22 really in earnest, or well, I guess it was a little in 2000 was when I started really covering it. So I was 24. Um, I think I was very much in favor of the death penalty. To me, it made sense. If you kill someone, you pay with your life. I think as I got older and you learn more about life, you go through more life experiences, you have friends that go through life experiences. It's not that I'm opposed to it. I'm not that either. I really do feel like it's a case by case basis. There were executions I saw, I wouldn't have given the person the death penalty had I been on the jury. Um, there were some executions I had no issue with whatsoever, like the rail car killer. I liked him, but I liked visiting with him. Had no issue watching that execution for everything he had done. I had a hard time with some of them. There were some. It's not even whether they deserved it, air quotes or not, based on the crime. You get to know the person, and you wonder, would they do something like this again? I don't think they would. I think that if they were given another chance in 30 years, that they would live a productive life. But then I used to feel really guilty for feeling that way, because I would think, it's easy for me to say because I only am seeing this person that's been on death row for 10 years. They didn't take something from me. They didn't kill someone that I loved, or, murder my child, or shoot my father in a carjacking and things like that. So it was complicated. And I can say, honestly, I don't have a hard stance on it one way or the other. I look at individual cases and then assess whether or not I personally, Michelle, think that it's an appropriate punishment. But in the end, it's not my call. I don't think that it's wrong for a crime victim to feel they need that retribution. And I write about it in the book, my stepdaughter, I'm not married now, but I was married in 2016. My stepdaughter was shot and killed in a robbery in California, and she was 17 years old. So terrible. Would I have had an issue with him getting the death penalty? No. They caught him and stuff. He did not. It was California, and the circumstances of the crime were such that they didn't go for the death penalty. But it completely undid my husband at the time, her dad, to the point that he started a drug habit. He did heroin, and he's dead now. Died of a drug overdose. So my point is that it's just not that simple.
Yeah, it's not so
life
cut and
is
dry.
ever simple, is it?
Yeah.
No, and that's exactly it. I think when you're young, it's easy to see things very black and white, and the older you get, the more you realize it's not. I think too, when I started out, again, yes, I'm pretty pro death penalty, and I feel all this empathy for the victim's family. But then once I had a child, once I was a mom, and I would see what these women are going through watching their child die in front of them, that really tore me up. Again, they didn't ask for this. It wasn't their fault that
it's got to be
this happened. I can't even imagine.
I think the appetite for capital punishment has definitely dropped slightly among the general population of the United States. But do you think a state like Texas will ever do away with it? I can't imagine. I mean, don't they lead executions pretty much every year in the state of Texas?
Texas usually does. Oklahoma did 1 year. Again, I think there's probably some evidence that that's true, based again on the fact that the death row population has dropped so dramatically.
Yeah.
Now that life without parole is an option. I think prior to that, people were uncomfortable thinking, okay, this is a pretty nasty crime, but if I give him a life sentence, he could be out in 40 years. And I don't love that either. So they would end up assessing death. Now that they have life without parole, they're using it way more. There are less people that are coming on to death row than ever before. I think in order for it to go away in Texas, they would have to have irrefutable evidence that someone innocent was executed, which is sad anyway, because then you've lost an innocent life. But my personal opinion is that's probably what it would take for Texas to ever not execute.
Wow. Yeah, I wonder. I do wonder, especially, I mean, there's still like 55 countries, I think, that still do capital punishment throughout the world. So, yeah. But it's
the number of states.
Not really in Europe, though.
No, definitely not in Europe. But it's strange that the U.S. would still be a part of that.
No, it's funny though. When I released the book, I participated in a radio show in Manchester, and they had callers that were calling in. The number of people in London or in Manchester, in the area, who were calling in supporting the death penalty which that shocked me because I thought I am about to just get hammered and it's going to be a whole bunch of people that are calling in saying they were all against the death penalty. And it wasn't that way at all. They were
I
calling
heard
in
in
saying that they
France,
wish they
too.
did have it. They were mostly saying, especially for child killers.
You see that all the
Yeah.
time. Whenever a child dies, they always say like,
Yeah,
"We want it."
I've noticed that. It seems like there's a call for it for that and not for others, but it still surprised me because I just didn't think that I would have that response.
So your book, Death Row: The Final Minutes, came out in 2018. Has the reaction been generally favorable, or have you got any upset like victims' family responses?
No, I don't know that they would have read it or anything. And I don't think that I say anything really negative. It's, I think anybody who reads it would see it is not a pro death penalty book. It is not an anti death penalty book. It is truly me going over the stuff that I struggled with, the things that I saw, the experiences I had, because it was a struggle. It was constantly wondering, am I doing the right thing? I feel guilty for rooting for this inmate. I feel guilty for feeling too much empathy for this victim. It was just constant pulling at you, and you do it for 12 years
Just
and
like inner
almost
conflict,
300
yeah.
executions, and it's a lot. And so really that's all it was. It's not to make anybody feel any particular way about the death penalty. The only thing I would like, if anybody took away from it, is to realize that both sides have a valid argument. I think so many people are so pro death penalty, and it's because they've never had a loved one who's in prison or been faced with that. And then you have people that are so anti death penalty because they've never had a loved one killed. I think that you have a lot of people with really strong opinions on both sides, neither of which try to see where the other is coming from whatsoever.
Well, I loved your book. It's probably one of the best books I've read.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Fascinating story.
Modern true crime book. It was great.
Definitely give insight to something
you.
that a lot of people never really realize or have any kind of personal connection to. So very interesting.
Yeah.
People, get yourself a copy of Michelle's book, Death Row: The Final Minutes, on Amazon. Michelle, it's been great chatting with you. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks. Yes,
And,
thank you
happy
both so much
holidays.
for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot.